As we're waiting for folks to come on in and get situated on yet again another Zoom call, but at least it's not too hot out today. We can enjoy this, our energy connections from our home. I want to welcome everyone to our second Energy Connections of this year. And I am Helen L. Malik. I'm Executive Director of CCIA, or Colorado Cleantech Industries Association. We are based here in Colorado, and we serve the industry and stakeholders who are interested in a clean energy and clean tech future. We want to also say today that we thank our wonderful participants, but also our great sponsors for this Energy Connections on sustainable pathways, advancing ESG objectives. We have two great sponsors who've helped with this Energy Connections series, and that's Faegre Drinker and NREL. And without those two great partners, we couldn't put this on. So we thank you so much. Now, in terms of ESG, we know that actually this has been around actually for quite some time, and we're lucky today to have such a great panel of experts on this subject. But in terms of what ESG means and where we're going to be taking it and what directions, I feel that we've only touched the tip of the iceberg. We've got a great panel for you today and a wonderful moderator who I will now introduce. That's Doug Benavento, who's counsel at Faegre Drinker. He has over 25 years of experience in the nexus of energy, environment, and the legal world. He's considered to be one of our top environmental lawyers in our state. In addition, Doug has served as the Deputy Administrator for the EPA Region 8 Administrator, and the Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. I would also like to say a shout out to CCIA member Engage, who brought this subject to us and said, we really want to work on ESG and want to spotlight it. So thank you for Engage, and also Faegre for doing so much to spotlight ESG and what the opportunities and challenges are. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug, who will be our moderator. Doug?
Thanks, Helen. I appreciate the kind introduction. And my mother does, in fact, consider me to be one of the better environmental lawyers in Colorado. I want to introduce our panel. We have a really great panel today, and I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some of their qualifications. I'm going to start with Jill Cooper, and she's probably the easiest one for me to start with. I've known Jill well over 20 years now, and she has a long career in environmental protection and management in a variety of fields. She's worked in the oil and gas industry. She's worked at a major law firm. She's worked at the AG's office, and also at CDPHE, where Jill and I first met, and where we worked together for a few years. She was key in so many of the different initiatives that we did at CDPHE. She drafted the first Greening Government executive order in the Owens administration, and was key in multiple initiatives at CDPHE that really encouraged the use of environmental management systems and for environmental compliance. She's now at Geosyntec, and as we were talking before the call started, Jill has been working on ESG issues long before they were called ESG issues, and is certainly truly one of the experts, not just in Colorado, but in the nation, on environmental, social, and governance development of programs. So I'm really thrilled to be here with Jill. We also have with us today Shaq Manning. Shaq has a really interesting and varied background, a very strong background in oil and gas, as you can tell from her current role. But there's so much more that she has done. She's served on multiple boards of really prestigious organizations such as Texas A&M and the University of Oklahoma. But most interesting for me, she served on a board for a company that provided space equipment and operations services for the International Space Station. And Helen, I won't digress this meeting by starting to ask Shaq all about that, but I'm really interested in it, and she's clearly worked on management issues and a variety of organizations, and is a great panelist. We also have with us Rob Ratchinsky. His career really reflects his entrepreneurial spirit. He grew up traveling the world and graduated from the University of Victoria in Canada, which probably does not have as good a football team as the University of Oklahoma or Texas A&M, but I'm certain it's a fine institution anyway. He started his career at Anadarko, then moved to Engage Management, and ultimately started his own company in 2016 after developing his own digitized field management platform that allows operators to better manage their field operations, making them a market leader, Engage a market leader in digitizing oil fields. So I want to welcome all of our moderators. I'm sure everybody's giving you a virtual applause right now. And I want to turn it over to first you, Rob, to say a few words, and then I'll go to you, Shaq, and then Jill, you're going to, I think, spend a few minutes going through ESG issues and sort of setting the baseline for us. So Rob, why don't you take it away?
Doug, thank you so much for the kind words and the introduction. Yeah, very excited to be here. I think, to get us kicked off, this conversation is not a new one, but I think there is a whole bunch of rhetoric sort of surrounding the current environment with respect to oil and gas, and just, sort of the large scale industries in the US right now. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of elevated pressure, not only from the investment communities, but from the general public as well. I think that this gives oil and gas specifically an opportunity to stand back and rebrand themselves, and really speak to, I hate to say it, the millennials. I'm on the tail end of that generation, but start to educate the general public on what our industry does. We're obviously hyper-focused and engaged on providing technology for the industry to start dealing with some of these initiatives and start shining visibility into their day-to-day operations from a corporate standpoint and operationally. But yeah, excited with this panel. I'm excited to learn just as much as those who are joining us today. So with that, I think we're going to kick it over to Jill first, correct, Doug? Doug, you're muted.
I was just seeing if anybody was paying attention. Why don't we go over to Shaq, and then we'll kick it to Jill, who will then move into her presentation. Shaq, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Doug, thank you so much. Again, it's an honor to be on this panel. I think why we come together and discuss these challenges and opportunity is really critical. I think Colorado's done a really good job of trying to bring different viewpoints, but also trying to bring people together to find solutions. And so, I'm looking forward to having a very, I think, engaging dialogue and discussion. And with that, I'm looking forward to hearing from Jill as well. So thank you, Doug.
Jill, you want to say a few words and move into your presentation?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And can you see the PowerPoint, or do you see my whole screen?
We've got the PowerPoint. I have it anyway.
Okay, great. Thank you. I just want to make sure. So Jill Cooper, Doug just embarrassed me tremendously with that introduction, with Geosyntec. And I spend most of my days and some nights counseling clients right now on ESG. And the main thing we're talking about, or we're trying to talk about, is how to make it something that's simpler, that you can stay one step ahead. So if you're I'm working with an ESG vice president or a manager, or sometimes it's not publicly traded. It could be a federal government, a state government, local government. It could be a privately held company. We have a couple clients we're working with that are owned by families. And they're all right now trying to figure out, what does ESG actually mean? So we spend half our time trying to explain to people the basics. Like materiality talks about what matters the most to the business you're in, to where you're located, to the stakeholders around you. And then you kind of apply it on a risk type basis. And a lot of people are asking, why is materiality such a big deal right now, and where is it going? And we call this the acceleration of materiality chart. And it basically says how we started out decades ago when Doug and I were both at CDPHE talking about global reporting initiative. And we ramped up to something that we call dynamic materiality. When I was at Anadarko, last oil and gas company I was at, on a quarterly basis, we were reassessing our materiality, and we were reporting it to the board through our risk process. So what the beauty of all of this is most companies have risk processes. What they might not have done is shown it. This is just one example of how you can show what matters and how much it matters, and then where should you really be focusing your efforts. But most companies have risk programs already. So what we like to bring it back to the clients and to others is, this is about risk management. This could be easily incorporated into a management system. In fact, we do due diligence for ESG for investors. We do ESG due diligence. And a lot of times what we're doing is we're running through all of the risks of what, like you look at all this information, reporting frameworks, benchmarking, comparing it to competitors, look at the existing environmental documents, you're researching, we even interview the companies. Usually it's the CEO or COO or somebody, because these aren't like giant companies. These are a little bit smaller companies that are coming to these boutique investment firms or the private equity firms. We're doing a mini materiality, and then we're evaluating how well the company has mitigated the risk and what's the residual risk. And you end up with something like this. This was a food company buying a vitamin company. And you see the topics: environment, governance, social. We evaluate how important we think they are to their stakeholders. We give them a materiality rating, and then we do the risk. And then beyond that, we'll even give recommendations on how they could further mitigate the risk, depending on how it comes out. And so what we try to explain to people is, be it social, governance, environment, this can be simplified by thinking of it through a risk process and through your current management system. You're expanding your EHS management system to be an ESG management system. The one question that came up in the preparation for this is, a lot of people are wanting to talk about climate risk. And I was recently presenting to a board, an upstream oil and gas company, and they really got into this. It was the same week that the Exxon, Chevron, Shell announcements all came out about what was happening. So they were very, very engaged and asking a lot of really good questions. And basically, at the end of the day, a lot of companies and entities are looking at TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Financial Related Disclosures. And if you look at this diagram in the middle, nowhere in here does it actually say climate, because this is how businesses manage risk. It doesn't actually say climate in this whole little diagram. Climate is implied everywhere, written everywhere else, but not in their one diagram that they say. It's part of your governance strategy. It's part of your governance. It's part of your strategy. How are you managing the risk? And what are the metrics and targets you're using to show the world that you're managing, or to show your stakeholders that you're managing this risk? And so when you look at a climate risk analysis, because the other thing people want to talk about is these scenarios. You hear a lot about scenarios. So this is from TCFD's website. There's a link on here. They have a tremendous guidance document that really, really lays this out. But companies run scenarios on all kinds of things. They say, if we bought this, if we did this, if we went here, if we expanded into this market, it doesn't matter what sector you're in, they run scenarios, and they do it in a risk and a cost basis. And then the analysis is how you use it to enhance your critical thinking. So the climate risk is somewhat similar. The difference maybe is that there's a lot of business drivers right now. A lot of people are asking, are you looking at your climate risk? And couple of the reasons are that the insurance companies are tired of paying for the cost of climate risk. The investors are worried about losing money or having to divest in you if you haven't managed this well. And they're worried because for years, nobody reported in their SEC filings. They're wondering if companies were really paying attention to it. Hence, Bloomberg came out with TCFD. You've got the SEC reevaluating their rules on disclosure. In Canada and Europe, Europe came out with its draft rules, which we're already using with the investors we work with, and the EU taxonomy. So all of that came down to this kind of crazy running towards carbon. And you have the International Energy Agency. In the US, you have the EIA. I feel like I'm the farmer, IEEIO. And then but basically what IEA did, and they just came out with a new report, is they have their traditional, some people would call it business as usual, but it's not really business as usual for all companies. Then you have the sustainable development scenario, the net zero scenario, and then whether you want to go company specific. So we spent a lot of time talking this through with companies, saying, here's what your peers are doing. Here's your different options. This has just happened to be an upstream oil and gas one. And saying what makes the most sense for you in a business sense. And we use the IEA, and you look at the IPCC. You can see the IPCC runs hundreds of scenarios, and the IEA for their 2 degree, their sustainable development scenario, they basically pick the lower trend line on all of IPCC's scenarios. So the good thing is companies don't have to be experts in this because we have these great groups out there. But what the company wants to do, this is going to sound really boring, identify the risk, assess the risk, and then come up with your strategy to mitigate the risk. That's how we've been making it easier. On the reporting side, and I'm almost done, this is what our reporting world looks like right now. This is a live link. Well, it can be a live link, but from the World Economic Forum. Basically, when you hover over these, it starts showing you how everything's connected. It's a little insane. We're all really hoping, those of us been doing this for a while, that it quiets down. There's a lot of people running in this space right now. But part of it is because there's a lot of investors and shareholders and insurance companies and banks that are all trying to figure out if you have the risk identified, assessed, and mitigated. This is just 2020's proxy season. And we end up tracking this for a lot of clients. And then if in their sector, there's a lot of focus on human rights, we try to help them stay one step ahead of their investors asking for it. It's not hard to stay ahead of somebody on this because no one's agenda is secret. It's all out there. I usually we did not do this, but I like Heineken's. They have a big report behind it, but I think they only would need to show these two things because part of what we're going to get into pretty soon is the risk around over-reporting. And I don't mean you're telling them too much facts. What I mean is they're trying to put too many words around those facts. And if you're going to have to start enhancing your SEC filings on this, you might want to go back and make sure you could really stand behind what you're saying. So we end up doing audits of people's websites and their reports. I'm more and more a fan of don't write a separate report, make it your website, and you can PDF it if you need to. But these guys, they don't call them risk, they call them focus areas. You can easily see their priorities and their life cycle. And they've linked it over here to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's sharp, it's clean, and they don't have to use a lot of words to show where they're going. So that was really what we had as the backup on this. And I'll stop sharing and I can save the other slides in case there's questions. Thank you for giving me this chance.
Sure. Well, thank you, Jill. I've seen that presentation before, and it's a really good one. And I'm always impressed when I see it, though. Rob, I want to ask you a question. I mean, I think you're privately held company. How does all this play into this? And you're the CEO, so you're the guy who gets to make all the calls. How do you see this? How does this play into your business? And how do you see ESG as managing risk, or is it just an additional layer of burden on you in terms of trying to run your business? How does it play into the way you do your business?
It's a great question. I think first and foremost, we've been having a lot of internal discussions about supporting our clients with some of the data aggregation, some of the validation, auditability, with what our technology provides. But I think you're hitting it right on the head. I'm really trying to get my team to focus in on what are we going to do internally to make sure that we are living up to the expectations of the investment layers, the general community, to make sure that we're out there being not only thought leaders, but actually actively living some of these principles. And that, to me, I think will permeate to our client set as long as we are handling it for ourselves. And I think that kind of dovetails into a greater discussion regarding when you look at some of these initiatives, are the oil and gas companies or are anybody part of the energy transition, are they going to be pointing directly at their service providers and their vendors to really showcase their efforts as well? The oil and gas industry is dominated by an environment where we look at data in arrears and we work day to day, but the capital investment is passed on to a third tier, a third party. So I think we want to be market leaders and making sure that we're raising this flag and making sure that everybody's paying attention, but also, and obviously, working with our clients to move some of that data. But I'm really interested to see what pressures the oil and gas operators are going to put on the service side to make sure, because of their intrinsic relationship, that they're also toting the party line and making sure that they're on the right track.
That's a really good point, Rob, because as Jill mentioned, it's not just insurers, it's not just investors, it's also customers. And having spent some time years ago practicing law for Walmart, they were experts at it wasn't about Walmart, it was about Walmart and their entire supply chain, and you're probably going to see some of that. Shaq, you've served on innumerable boards, it seems like. How have you seen this play out on the different boards that you've served on, and what they're looking for from their institutions, and what board members are, frankly, whether it's a public company or it's a private company, whether they're asking for this type of this sort of transparency and reportability?
Doug, that's a very insightful question. And I think we heard when Jill, she made a very eloquent presentation, and where she starts off with saying, notice that we're not talking about climate, we're talking about risk. And then for us to start to think about, if it's part of risk, then you have an obligation. So it's not a choice, it's an obligation. And so you see things as, I've got to minimize or de-risk. And that starts to set you up and saying, in order to de-risk, you actually have to measure, and you have to have data to do that. And that's where I think, we'll hear some more from Rob with Engage Mobilize. But, once you say, okay, I've got to de-risk, and the only way I got to de-risk is I have to understand my baseline and measure. So what boards are talking about, and you see this, universities, at Texas A&M and OU, and I know at School of Mines they're having these discussions too. It's like, okay, how are we going to prepare our students for going into these roles in the energy sector or in business? And then how are we going to, and I think Colorado is a really exciting opportunity, because I'm seeing both preparing students for what that future role looks like. And then I'm also seeing kind of in the entrepreneurial sector, a lot of technology, core technology that's around measurement and also around transparency to understand what your operations are doing. So it's a really kind of powerful place that we're in. Where I get concerned about, and I think Jill had mentioned this a little bit, is people using just words to wrap around things. So that's where I see this trying to have, if we can have more of this digital data as well as transparency in our data and start having those discussions, I think that's going to take us really to that next step. But we struggle with that right now.
Well,
I agree. Real quick, I mean,
Rob. Yeah.
So it's, to me, some of the auditability that surrounds these data sets are, how do I put it? They're archaic. And I don't, we're creating reporting sort of based on Jill's comments. Be careful, right? Be careful what reporting you're going to create. But right now I look at some of those structures and it's just not a whole lot of meat behind them. They're very, they're set up, there's good intentions there, but there really is no auditability in a lot of what's going on. And I think that is going to be an important story if these corporations can prove to the general public and prove to the investment community that they are taking steps by adopting technology, by using validation with some of those technologies. But there's just not a whole lot of actual, there's not a whole lot behind it right now. And I think that's what the students and the teams need to drive towards.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think I'm moving generally in the same direction, but let me take maybe a look at the other side of the coin, and let me mix some more metaphors before I get onto my point. A criticism of ESG are the metrics aren't precise, they're not homogeneous. You have this like smattering of different measurements with different requirements that everybody kind of looks at differently. That are purporting to measure the same thing, but are really doing it differently. Talk a little bit about that, because as this has been going on for a while, and folks like Jill have been working on this for quite a while, but not everybody has. How impactful are some of the measurements in ESG, and is it true that they aren't homogeneous, they aren't precise, and therefore they could lead to imprecise conclusions about the risk a company faces? And I'll kick it over to anybody who wants to who wants to take
Well,
it.
I just shared screen real quick because I had 2 backup slides. I wasn't sure if we wanted to go here, but there's as I said before, the reporting world is very complicated and they are trying to narrow down. So Doug, when you and I were at the state, I went to a UN Environment Program meeting in 2000 and the investors were hovering around us going, how do you measure this? So this isn't anything new. They've been talking about this for a really long time and they just don't know quite how to do it. But all of these transparency groups popped up. You have the groups that publish frameworks and guidelines. You have the group that go and mine data. Then you have the groups that go, I used to get like 200 surveys a year at Anadarko and you had to figure out which ones to fill out. That's the group that pull data and then they send you a survey and say, fill it out, make it better. And you're running for a score. And then you have those that rank you. And yes, you are right that it is, it's harder and harder to figure out which ones of these matter. What I'm starting to see more and we're starting to see, and I'm kind of excited about is that, we're starting to see sectors develop sector-specific programs. You saw it a long time ago in the Forest Stewardship Initiative, American Chemistry Council's Responsible Care. You saw these standards that came up and they were narrowly tailored to their sector. How do you measure whether a forest service products company is managing for the health of the forest to protect habitat? It was the spotted owl back then, right? And the chemical industry had a similar issue. Well, today you're looking at the responsible steel standard came out. Canada came out with towards sustainable mining, TSM. ICMM is their international mining group, and they have a set of principles. API is developing, as they do, a very complex set of principles. And then you have groups like boutique groups that are NGO/consulting firms or private firms, like Project Canary purchased Trustwell, and Trustwell will go out to your site, your pad by pad, and assess whether you meet the standards of what responsible gas would look like. The other group we're actually going through the training this week is Equitable Origins. They teamed up with Rocky Mountain Institute, that Rocky Mountain's doing the methane piece, MIQ, and Equitable Origins is doing all the rest. And patch those two together, and they would send someone like us out to go and audit a site. And we would dive into the numbers because the big number for oil and gas is methane leaks, methane intensity. And so they have a whole big process of how we dive in and evaluate whether the methane intensity is what it is. Very similar to how CARB goes about requiring verification or validation of data if you're going to trade it in the market. So it's starting to come. It's still a little chaotic, but yeah, they hire people like us, the investors do, to go in and figure out if it's true. And we can, because most of us have gray hairs and we've been doing this a long time, we can kind of puncture through the fluff. And also the investment firms are hiring people from companies. They're hiring people from Cheniere and Anadarko and all these other companies to be their ESG lead. So you're talking about people who did carbon reporting most of their life for the industry. For the mining sector, the mining investor we work for, they're hiring people from the mines. And so they're also, the investors and banks and insurance companies are getting pretty savvy on how to evaluate it. However, it is still kind of crazy right now. And I'm really hoping it starts settling in on a few standards that everyone wants to use.
Jill, I'd like to just add, to the point of, that it's working hand in hand with some key organizations and thought leaders to how you work through this. I also would have, I think just reflecting upon, Cimarex's journey on this, in 2019, we said, and Tom Jordan led this, the CEO, and he said, let's go have this he initiated, and we had an intensive project just to analyze and catalog all the sources of our emissions so that we could have these conversations that Jill is talking about. And we put, brightest minds across the company. So it wasn't just, here's the environmental team. We took engineers, we had field people, we had accountants. So we just had this very diverse mix of people to say, you're tasked to go understand that. We had our COO and work on this. And we basically said, we want to find ways to lessen our overall emissions, regardless whether they were governed by state or federal regulations, and so EPA is, it's a convenient starting point, but they don't necessarily have a comprehensive way to capture and document all your emission sources. And they have some guidelines and they use lookup tables. And so these lookup tables are based on a series of assumptions, right? And so by just going through this really rigorous process, we were able to start to have some of the really key conversations of, well, what are we going to quantify? Where are the areas that we can focus in on the most? And, I'm going back to this. I never want to see us regulate innovation. So I never want us to get into regulating innovation. So you take the entrepreneurs. So once you can say, okay, here really is our true footprint. Here are the areas, and here are maybe some ways. And then it's how do you start working with the entrepreneurs? Rob is one group, Engage. We also worked with a company that was out of Colorado that came out of the university that was doing fixed ground 24/7 laser-based inspection and long path. And you go, okay, and that was an innovation that no one really, and we were able to do aerial flyovers. So these different entrepreneurs, and then understanding our operations. So that was like our starting point in 2019. And then I think then you start to say, okay, what do we really know? Then how are we going to go quantify it? And then now how are we going to go put some ways that we can hold ourselves accountable? And so that was, I think the next part of discussion. And then you're having these discussions with these groups of how do you think about de-risking? So it's a journey.
Shaq, could you speak a little bit to, looking at some of that, we're obviously seeing the remuneration structures all the way up to the executive level change based on some of these quote unquote new metrics. How are you guys tackling that if you're looking at embedding new technologies, but also if the CEO, if Tom's going to roll out, and I know Ovintiv is doing this there's a lot of companies moving very quickly towards this. How do you guys, were you guys thinking about initiating that corporately so that, like you were getting at, you're involving the entire organization in some of these efforts? What is that looking like internally for these oil and gas companies?
So, Cimarex here was one of the first to take on and tie executive compensation to the results or the accountability of reducing emissions. So that was, Cimarex is a smaller independent. It was a big step. It was a bold step, but it starts with that's a responsibility and commitment of the executive team. And that means that gives, instead of just saying, well, we're just going to hold our environmental safety group. When you start to say all the executive team, their compensation is going to be paid to the results, then it also allows for different people in the organization to work together on it, to your point. And it also, now, if you're going to tie it to compensation, you want to argue that you should have higher compensation. You're really going to want to make sure that you're measuring, and there's going to be this tension between the board and the executive team, which is a healthy tension, right? So it's proved to me that you did reduce emissions. And so then you have to start going into your operations and very thoughtfully going through and showing and measuring, and it changes the whole dynamic of your company. I think it's a powerful tool. And that would be one thing I think, of encouraging people to do that. I think it also, ingenuity, right? It also causes, instead of having these very rigid, if there's a better way to quantify a smoky flare, or if there's a better way to eliminate flaring, or if there's a better way, let's say to recycle water and stop the transporting or reduce that cost, you start to have those conversations, and it's tied again to the bottom line. It moves people in that direction. And you're encouraging the entrepreneurs, I think, which really have these creative ideas of how to solve some of these problems. And you start to get them where you're sharing the same set of data, and you can then measure and go, okay, this is a program that is really making an impact. And you can tie that down to your metrics.
Thank you.
One of the questions, because we've been talking about it a little bit, is some of the, I think the climate metrics, the E of ESG is real measurable. That's not difficult at all. The S part becomes a little bit more difficult, the social part, and that's the part when we were discussing earlier, sort of the lack of homogeneity, the less precise measurements, and where that becomes a problem. Right now, the SEC is looking at, has put out 15 questions that they've asked for comment on, presumably in anticipation of them putting additional requirements on at least publicly traded companies to do enhanced reporting. There's legislation in Congress that has been reintroduced that would focus on this as well. Is this the right, should government be getting involved in this at this point? Is this defined enough where it would be helpful? Because this goes back to your point, Shaq, and Jill and I used to talk about this quite a bit when we were at the health department, is government isn't always the best the best incubator for innovation or encouraging innovation in the private sector. What government often does is put out a reg and they freeze innovation at that moment, because that's what people know they have to comply with. So they freeze innovation. Of all things, hog farms was where we were dealing with it back in 20 years ago. Do you guys have any thoughts on whether this is the right time for government to get involved and start putting out requirements, or should they let the market sort of put together, sort of hash this out and let the market determine, let investors and customers and insurers determine what they're looking for, and then after that step in and say, we've got something that's more mature now, more developed. Now government should step in and start laying out sort of minimal requirements. And I don't know, Shaq, Jill, or Rob, if you have any thoughts on that.
Doug knows I have an opinion on everything, but either the others want to go first this time, and then I'll jump in.
Jill.
No, Jill, you go, but I'll start with let's go market. And we'll hear from Jill because she probably has a more of a government perspective on it.
Well, so where I like the EU went was they started with their taxonomy, and they're regulating the investors that are making claims that they're selling ESG stock. So because it's kind of truth in reporting for them, if they're saying you're investing in these companies and we have a fiduciary duty to you, the investor, to say we've done our homework to verify, like if somebody's going to say I buy chickens from a sustainable supply chain, it's kind of truth in advertising in a way. And I've kind of liked that trend because it's Walmart, as you mentioned, was the first one to do the supply chain piece that I've seen the first big guys. I mean, the Interface and others have done it, but the really big mover on the supply chain world was Walmart from an environmental perspective. They can make things move a lot faster than government. They don't really stand in the way of innovation because they don't care how you get there. They just care that you get there. And so what we've been watching that's been really fascinating on the investor side is as the investors are starting to get requirements from the EU and Canada and other countries to say, if you want to claim these are ESG investments, you have a fiduciary duty to verify that they are. And that's driving every supply chain, be it from the plastic resin business to the vitamin business to wherever, to say, whoa, I have to be able to stand behind this, what I'm sharing with people. And it's not just the publicly traded, it's the privately traded, the banks and everyone. They're tired of paying the cost of bad decisions. So they're really driving it. So if I were in the SEC shoes, I would give out the principles. I would cut out a system like the UN, like the EU did, and say, those of you that want to make these claims, you've got a duty to go and verify. Or if you're a company on the SEC side and you have a material risk that you haven't been reporting, start reporting it. Because usually when you start reporting it, you start taking action. I'm not a fan of them trying to regulate down to the nuances, and I never have been. Having been government and industry, government isn't very efficient at that. They're not very efficient at running markets, period. They're pretty good at taxing. So that's where they could head towards with like social cost of carbon and other things, is they could look at taxing the impact to pay for the impact, the results of the impact. but I'm not a fan of them getting in the mix and trying to figure out what's best, because it never stands still.
We're actually to pile on there, Joe. We're from a different perspective, and from a technology perspective. Engage was just awarded a contract through the CIBR program with the Department of Defense, and we're really excited to not look for regulation from the feds, but investment. There's grant programs, and what's amazing, if you look and you really start to dig in at what the government is asking right now, whether that's the DOE, the DOD, it's all supply chain related. It's how do we reduce our fuel costs? How do we reduce our imprint as how big of an entity they are specifically, looking to companies like Engage to help them with that. And so, that's what I'd like to see. And I think that's what's happening, but you have to get the word out to the entrepreneur community, to the technology companies that are out there, that these programs exist and the government is willing to either grant or invest in your technology. And then you can take that to the private market. And so I think we're all looking to solve the same issues. And so from my perspective, I like government involvement, but I like it from the G in the equation. Let's pump some money into the entrepreneurs and into machine learning, AI, that can help us with a lot of these initiatives. So we're really excited about that. But I sit and I say, let's let the market dictate, because if we don't, we're going to end up, especially as an industry where we started, where there's not a whole bunch of trust in the ecosystem with how the government has shaped up over the last decades. But yeah, that's my take on it as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I tend to agree with you, Rob. I recently gave an interview to Inside EPA. It's a trade magazine, and they were asking my opinion of the Biden administration, which I was happy to give, and I'm sure was happily received. And one of the points I tried to make was, our carbon emissions as a nation have been coming down significantly over the past 10 or 15 years. And there's been minimal, at least from the federal government perspective, minimal federal government, regulation of greenhouse gases. And what has been driving the reduction hasn't been government intervention. What's been driving the reduction has been technology. The better technology around renewables, wind and solar, and frankly fracking as well has made a significant difference. So the advice I gave to the Biden team is be careful what you do from a regulatory perspective, because what you may end up doing is interfering with market forces that are already driving what you're trying to accomplish. And if you want to, it is a fraught prospect to try and jump out in front of what the market is doing and say, we're now going to lead you and we're going to put some regulation on, because what you risk doing is stunting that development. In fact, I see you shaking your head, and I'm sure you've got some thoughts. You want to weigh in?
Well, yeah, just to add, when government can be a convener to bring different groups together, that can be very powerful, right? So I call them, like, whether it's forced therapy sessions but when you can bring different people to the table to start to have those discussions, that causes automatically you're going to get some people that are going to walk away, that are going to start to self-reflect and go take those steps in their journey. When government can be the convener of test beds, like we had here in Colorado, we had the Monitor program. And although maybe not all those technologies went on to being commercial or viable, it was a way to start testing in a safe environment for different operators of mitigation technologies and techniques. And then I think the other piece I would still say is, like, as Rob mentioned, that CIBR program, that's a government role where they're saying, okay, we're gonna take a very small amount and invest in R&D in small entrepreneurial companies. And they can direct maybe the theme of that, but how that gets implemented and gets scaled. And, obviously you have to have market pull on that. Those are the types of things that, we really need. And those types of, like with Engage, if you think about being able to automate and really understand your operations and your impact, and then being able to make changes in real time or mitigate, is really critical. And on paper, you might be able to say, well, I bought some carbon credits, but I think tying it back to operationally, what did you do to improve, is something that, I really want to have more of a discussion on that. And that's an example of how government, the DoD CIBR helps, because that can help build out, and then we can get the benefit of that.
Hey, and Doug, there's one thing I was going to share real quick. If anybody thinks there aren't standards, this is the responsible steel. Those are the principles. They have 12 principles, and here's all the standards that they refer companies to, all these international goals, standards, treaties, whatever it is. So it's not like there's not out there. It's just government doesn't have to create them for once, because the industry created, or not-for-profits, stakeholder groups created these. So human rights, you've got 7 that the companies need to look at. So it's not like there's a gap in requirements.
Excellent. That's great. Well, but while we're on the topic of government, so we've talked about government in the context of, sort of mandating and forcing out requirements, particularly in public traded companies. But we haven't talked about, and I wrote something about this the other day, is government itself. Federal government and federal and state governments and federal, state, and local governments are one of the biggest investors and lenders in the world. But they haven't sort of adopted in their evaluation of grants and loans ESG principles that they apply to people who are applying for loans and applying for grants. And not all of them probably, if you're applying for a Pell Grant, that's not going to apply to you. However, there are programs out there. We used to run at EPA, WIFIA, Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, same thing, TIFIA on the transportation side. Why isn't government applying sort of materiality assessments to at least a subset of loans and grants that they are putting out to do 2 things? One, to use their market force to sort of start pushing this stuff down into people that want to do business with the federal government. Hell, if you want to do a public-private partnership with the federal government, why don't they do it? And second, and probably more importantly, this is taxpayer money, and they are an investor. They are, heck, in some cases, they may be an insurer. Why aren't they trying to get a better sense of risk of the companies and frankly, states and local governments that they're giving the money to in order to ensure that they're wisely using taxpayer dollars? Discuss. Jill, do you have thoughts?
You're gonna ask me first. Of course. I think there are pieces of this out there: preferential purchasing, points for something, small business or disadvantaged businesses, veterans. There are different pieces of the E and the S out there that government has tucked into requirements over time. I do agree. I think it's coming. I think they're so focused on SEC right now that they haven't brought that out in social cost of carbon, which I think the CEQ is managing that piece. I think that the challenge has always been they want to regulate carbon, but the Clean Air Act isn't really letting them do it very easily. NSPS Section 111B and D, 2 tiny little provisions of the Clean Air Act is what the whole, bill, the CPP was written on, 1,200 to 1,400 pages of regulation. So I think they're trying to figure out what's working for business that could work for them. And yes, they drive a big chunk of our economy. I think it's only a matter of time and they're going to come with it. But right now it's kind of a disparate set of requirements that you see tucked in federal grants. I think it's a great idea, though. It'd be great to see if somebody could propose it to government and say, are you willing to preferentially purchase our product because we've done these things?
Right.
Do you think there's any, people have made attempts at this in the past. What do you think are the barriers or the friction points on that?
my sense would be it could end up being a level of complexity. You know, do you have the folks at the agencies that are in the position to evaluate this stuff? I think it would come down to also what you're looking at. You know, like I said, you know, under like the revolving loan funds, you know, you're in many cases you're providing money to folks that really need the money for compliance. I mean, this is a public health issue. So to say, we're not gonna we're not gonna give you a grant because you don't have the S part, the materiality assessment for the S part down, I think that would be difficult to sustain. If they were to do it, and I don't know if it's a good idea or not. I'm sort of seeing though that if this is the way the train is moving, you know, what it would look like. What they could, again, there are loans out there and grants out there, though, and certainly partnerships with the federal government where they're competitive, where you have options, and where it's not necessarily a public health issue. And I look at WIFIA as the example, and I say, you know, we turned down when I was at EPA not a lot, but WIFIA loans because it was so competitive. You know, why couldn't you start talking to them about where's your materiality assessment? Same thing with TIFIA, same thing if you want to do any public-private partnership. We're about to enter a relationship with you, company. Let us better understand the risks that you provide to us, the federal government, if we are in fact going to do a partnership with you. So that,
and Doug, local governments doing that already. I mean, local governments been putting that in the states, and some states do in their contracts for a long time. Prove you're using recycled. If you want to go do work for the state of Washington in their CDOT and their DOT program, you got to prove you're trying to use X amount of recycled materials. So it's out there. It's just, I don't know why the federal government hasn't made it. It's a good question on the barriers, though. Doug usually knows that better than I do.
I'm the barrier guy. Jill's the solution person, though. Rob, you have any thoughts?
I continue to kind of hear throughout this discussion that the barrier and where I kind of started with is the auditability of the data. If you're going to put pressure on these organizations to report back to you and that their grant money or their, you know, their tax credit or whatever the vehicle for that is going to be, I mean, that inherently lies the problem. And I think Jill did a really good job kind of showing us that it's not that there isn't, you know, all these standards out there. It's that you're adding a lot of risk to the equation if within a given industry you haven't come out and sort of formally said like, hey, this is what you're going to have to do to get at this money. And I think our investors now, especially with oil and gas, are applying that pressure. But I agree with you, Doug. I mean, I would like to see, because there's such a huge component of that G spend, I would like to see them kind of come out and formally say, these are going to be the parameters that we're going to operate under, and back up sort of what the investment community and the private sector is doing right now.
Well, as always, the private sector is ahead of government. That's just the way it works. And I do think there is an element of this when it comes to sort of protecting public investment. If you believe that ESG materiality assessments are important to protect investors, and then you've got to believe that the taxpayers and, you know, the sort of a forced investor in the federal government, but an investor nonetheless, that if you're going to protect their money, that there may be all or parts of this that are important to start incorporating into how the federal government spends its money. Anyway, it's interesting. Well, we've got 5 minutes left. What I haven't received any questions yet on from the audience, so I want to turn it to you three. And what have we talked about that we should be discussing that people would walk away with saying, hey, wait, this is something I needed to know. What haven't I asked y'all?
Yeah, Doug, there's only one other thing I would share that people might be interested in, and it's the UN, or it's the World Business Council on Sustainable Development created it. It's a balance sheet that I can't find it online anymore. We got it online. I refer to it all the time. But if you're looking at this from a business perspective, companies are either trying to protect the value they have or create new value. And if you want to translate, because the biggest challenge I've seen with the environmental health and safety professionals that get pulled into ESG is translating between what they're used to talking about with regulatory requirements into risk and cost and opportunities, because these aren't all risks. Sometimes you can turn a risk into an opportunity, and that's where you get into the value creation piece. Companies are out there saying, I am greener than so-and-so, hence buy me first, pay more for me, whatever it is. They've moved from this value protection risk management into reducing costs and increasing revenues. And I just like the way these guys made it real simple and they put in a balance sheet.
Thank you. Robert, Shaq, any thought, any other?
I love that you just put that up there, Jill. I mean, I feel like I was just looking at Engage's value props to our clients. So just a shameless plug there, but that please send that my direction.
I guess what, as we're going through this energy transition, this is just something that no one company or organization can do by themselves. And so it's really important that we come together and we talk about these key issues. And I hope that the challenge I have for everyone is how can we work together on some of these and how can we move into the value creation. And I just want to thank everyone for their time. And it's been some of our best solutions that we've had at Cimarex from a technology have come out of Colorado. And that's a really, if you think about that, that's a really powerful thing. We are, in New Mexico, Texas, throughout the US, and we've had ways that we've driven innovation and partner together, but then also really reflect about how we can look at our data and how can we be a part of those convening bodies or participate. So thank you very much for today. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to working with more of the people on this call and together.
Thank you, Shaq. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Rob. Helen, I'm going to turn it over to you to wrap it up.
Thank you, Doug, Shaq, Jill, and Rob. That was great. A lot to digest and to think about. We are super excited that you were able to contribute on this very, very important subject. Again, thank you for your time, and I'm sure our participants will be reaching out to you. One question, Haley, will we have any of the presentations available or?
I can check in with Jill about that on offline.
Okay.
Recording will be available.
Well, thanks so much. Yes, we will have this recording. Thanks, everyone. Again, special shout out to our partners at Faegre, NREL, Jim Spanstra. You have really helped us to keep this program very vital and alive, and our friends at Engage too. One quick thing to keep on your radar, CCIA is going to be opening up very shortly our oil and gas Cleantech Challenge application. So if you have an ESG solution, keep in mind that we will be opening applications for that very shortly. So keep an eye out for our emails, and you can also visit us on coloradocleantech.com. So with that, we will conclude our second Energy Connections program for this year, and stay tuned because we'll have another great program coming up in the third quarter. Also, last shout out to Haley Whitaker. Thank you, Haley, for keeping us on track and getting us organized. Appreciate everyone's time today. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Haley, and
Thank you.
thanks to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.